Investor Connect podcast program. This is Hall T. Martin. I'm the host of the show, in which we interview angel investors, venture capital, private equity, family offices, and many other investor groups for startups and growth companies. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you for joining us. Well, hello, this is Hall Martin with Investor Connect. Today we're here with Mendy Ouzillou on Are You Irritating Your Audience? Points of Friction and the Unasked Questions. Mendy, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Hall, for inviting me to discuss points of friction, the unanswered questions with you and your audience.
Can you define points of friction and what specific circumstances are you addressing there?
So some members of your audience may have heard of points of friction between sales and customers. But if we look at it in the most general sense, points of friction are any number of things that get in the way of achieving your goals, whether it's under your control or out of your control. So, for example, there may be some regulatory requirements that your company's products have to adhere to, clearly something out of your control. However, most things are either indirectly or directly under our control. And for this podcast, since we're targeting entrepreneurs and members of 10, I'd like to focus on pre-money startups to pre-revenue businesses getting ready to sell their first products. In other words, let's focus on the pitch made to investors and the pitch made to customers and what your presenters or presenters in general can do to minimize these points of friction.
Cool. So tell us more about points of friction for the early stage company. We see a lot of those coming through. Give us your thoughts about that.
So for the sake of this discussion, we'll cover points of friction that are really specifically related to verbal points of friction. So this would be oral and written communications. And what I really wanted to share with your audience is the points of friction as they're related to audience questions. So often I see presenters sometimes create more questions than they're trying to answer, or they're not answering the questions, or even answering basic questions. And I can tell that the audience is getting a little bit upset or fidgety. So that's what we're going to cover today. We're not going to cover like nonverbal points of friction. I would consider some of those to be showing up for the presentation dressed inappropriately, speaking at too low of a volume, or too fast for that matter, or one of my favorites, font so small that nobody in the audience can read it. We're also not going to address the behavioral issues that can occur post-meeting. And this, I know you and I have spoken a little bit about this previously, but like not following up, not taking advice, not addressing concerns, so those sorts of things. However, we will absolutely discuss proper preparation to minimize points of friction, or like I called them, these questions that tend to go unanswered. So let's set the stage a little bit and look at an audience's state of mind. You know, as audience members, we go in there with preconceived notions about what we expect to hear. And if these expectations are not addressed or really sometimes even reset, then the audience has difficulty moving on from that dialogue in their mind. You oftentimes will see people kind of maybe even glazing over literally as you're speaking. Either they're bored, they're tired, or maybe what's really happening is that they're expecting you to say something and you haven't done that. And so they get stuck on that specific point. So since we're talking about those things, these points of friction then become stumbling blocks between you as a presenter and an audience, and it prevents the audience from following you any further. Or worse, they don't want to listen to you any further because you've tripped them up and you've left them behind. And as I just mentioned a little bit before, these points of friction often take the form of what I call the unanswered questions.
Can you define in broad terms what buckets these points of friction might fall into and go a little bit deeper into it?
Oh, absolutely. Within the framework that we've been discussing, these points of friction fall into the following categories of unanswered questions. So I think the very first one is maybe certainly one of the most important ones, and that's the audience's unasked questions that they expect you to cover during the presentation and at a specific point in the presentation. The second one is the audience's asked question that does not get answered. That is a surprising one but oftentimes you see a presenter being asked a question and they will meander off, and sometimes it's as easy as answering just yes or no. The third one is also fairly important, and hopefully does not happen too often, but it's the information that has been presented that creates more questions than it answers for the audience. And so you just create sort of a situation where instead of being very specific, answering the questions, presenting the information in a good way, your audience is left feeling even more confused than when you started. Now, a case could be made for the questions the audience do not even know to ask. However, those are not immediate points of friction. These will come up post-presentation when the audience has had time to reflect on the information. Now, the cool thing is that if done properly, if you can kind of present these questions and provide really compelling answers, it can really help differentiate a presenter from potentially others if it's in a series of pitches to investors or even to potential customers. For example, you could highlight a reliability issue with competing product that your company or your product addresses, or soft benefits that are highly valued but not typical for your type of product. So again, these are not things that necessarily your audience is even going to come up with on their own, but may do so at a later time. So wouldn't it be cool if you actually got there and were able to address these things that they didn't even think about they should care about?
Well, absolutely. It makes a big difference in communicating with the audience and building rapport is to remove the points of friction, as you put it, in order to carry on with the message of the business or the startup or whatever they're proposing.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I think a lot of times we forget that presentations are really about educating your audience. Of course, you want to educate them about subjects that they care about.
Absolutely. So tell us more about this subject and why we should care. Unasked questions. What's more about that?
So, well, first of all, since I'm making a pitch about points of friction, I hope I've addressed at least the first unasked question or the unanswered question that everyone in the audience should have had, which is the definition of the points of friction. But like you just said, let's move on now to what hopefully was the second thing that came to the audience's mind, and certainly your own, which is, so why should we care about any of this? Well, the reason we should care is that most of the time we want more than just an engaged audience. We want their buy-in, their approval, their time, their capital, a contract, purchase, endorsements, any number of things that come after you've had a chance to present to them. Fundamentally, we want something to happen that extends beyond their time as an audience. I mean, look, even in the case of a purely educational, informational presentation, we're still trying to convince people to stay engaged for not just the time of the presentation, but also likely through calls to action, things that they're going to do after they've listened to your presentation. At the end of the day, we've all created presentations, and I'm hoping that these are not just for our own benefit. The way I see it, if you can't sell your idea, you can't expect your audience to buy it. And we should never expect the selling to stop after the presentation. So that's also a key point. I mean, you and I are discussing the subject today as it relates to that moment when you are there presenting to the audience, but marketing or selling of an idea doesn't stop at that point. There's certainly a lot of things that have to happen afterwards. And I spoke about some of those things previously, but following up with your audience members, taking in their feedback, answering their follow-up questions, whatever it takes.
Absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. So you've mentioned a lot about these points of friction, but what are some of the root causes that you see coming up in that area?
So the root causes are as varied as the type of presenter. It's almost impossible for me to create a complete list. However, what I'd like to do is, and this is going to take a little bit of the time here during our conversation, but I think it's important that we'll cover at least some of the basic categories and fairly good sampling of examples of each, because what I really want to be able to do is just get people to think about this. These are not necessarily ultra specific, but they are in fact generic enough that I'd like for it to engender a question so that when people are presenting or even preparing, I should say, for their presentations, they can go through this list and hopefully they'll see, oh, you know what, I've made that bad assumption, or here's a root cause that I need to address that will create problems for me. So let me go ahead and go through some of these. So one of the first ones is we make incorrect assumptions about our audiences. And sometimes, of course, we all have our share of ego, but let's not forget that when you're presenting, you are there for them. And we need to respect the time of our audience. They've already made a conscious decision to attend and listen to you speak. So let's respect their time. Another one along those lines is logic may not align with your audience's decision-making process. You want to be able to connect with your audience by making it easy for them to understand what you're presenting, whether it's financially, intuitively, logically. Another thing that I see is this idea of, hey, if they're the right investor, they'll just get it like I do and they'll be equally excited. I think it's a much better starting point to say that even in the case that your idea, proposal, or product is in fact truly special, we can't expect everyone else to feel the same way. We all come different backgrounds, different experience. So it's important for us to communicate effectively with our audience and not make these assumptions. Another one is, hey, my presentation is really easy to understand, when in fact we're making the audience work too hard to understand the concepts being presented. Another one, and I've seen this where the pitch deck and the corporate deck and the customer deck, these are all the same, and there's just slight variations in between, or in some cases, none at all. But the assumption that all audiences will want to see the same material. I mean, a great example of this is that we would never present to an engineering team, for example, who's designing in a semiconductor product. We'd never show them necessarily the same information or present the same information as we would to the procurement team of the customer. So when we talk about these incorrect assumptions about our audiences, oftentimes I just see it as we're not really putting ourselves in the position of our audience. We really need to figure out if we're presenting to ourselves or to a specific audience that we're trying to target. So in my mind, better to assume that no one knows who you are or why your idea is so great, and that will cut out a lot of the incorrect assumptions.
One of the most common mistakes I see is entrepreneurs who, when they pitch an investor, really talk just about the product and how the product works and why they built it and how they built it. And in essence, they're treating the investor like a customer. But the investor's not the customer. They're not buying the product. They're investing in the company. And so they want a much more holistic view of the company, the competition, the team, the financials, all the other factors that go around it. But there seems to be a point of friction where the entrepreneur thinks that if I can sell you on my product, well, then I've sold you on my business. And there's a mismatch there for sure.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's the perfect lead-in to the next root cause, which is inadequate preparation. I've had my own startup. I know what it's like pitching to an audience. But one of the fundamental things that I've oftentimes seen, both as an audience member and presenting myself, is we all like to kind of sell the idea or the technology, when in fact, there's a big difference between understanding an idea / technology and a product. And this concept of the difference between an idea or technology and a product, I mean, that's a whole other discussion that we could have in the future. If you're presenting to an audience and you're asking them to invest, you better get past the point that this is just an idea or technology and show how you're going to be able to monetize that and turn it into a real product. Another one that I've seen, and this seems to be incredibly common, and I actually don't understand why it is, but as a inadequate preparation, it's this making very poor assumptions regarding projected revenue. Somehow thinking that the total available market, for example, will be perfectly addressable by your company and in total be addressable by your company. And so I see revenue projections which are far beyond what really a rational business plan should present. I'm sure you've probably seen this yourself many times.
Yeah, the biggest issue is the time factor. People get the revenue right, but they just way off on the time. Instead of taking a year to get to $100,000, it takes 3 years to get to $100,000. And so they greatly underestimate the time it takes to really put sales into place and to get the product out there and support it properly and all the systems that really go. Just the technology by itself doesn't do that. It's the entire team you're building. And that just takes time. And people are not very good about estimating that.
Completely agree. So kind of moving on to some points that you touched on previously, the other part of the inadequate preparation is just not understanding what your goals are and your audience's ability to help you achieve them. So this means not tailoring your presentation to your audience. Like I said, you just sort of touched upon this previously, but look, startups like to discuss the opportunity. They like to kind of show this shiny new idea, but the investors want to focus on risk. The customers want to focus on the value, the benefits versus price. So again, it's about kind of falling in love with what you're doing, which is great, but not being able to convert that into the language that your audience wants to hear. Then finally, this one certainly can get interesting if you're sitting in the audience, but if you're confusing or boring your audience. So if you're confusing or boring your audience, what this really means is you're not connecting with your audience on multiple levels, whether they be emotional to financial. You're potentially complicating basic concepts and not simplifying complex ones. You should really be asking yourself, are you removing obstacles or are you adding them with your presentation? Another one is everybody likes to be a brand whiz about creating a new brand and how it will be so powerful. But if what you're presenting is half-baked in the minds of your audience, then I think you're going to lose a lot of credibility with them. And this is especially true, of course, if your marketing model requires branding. So be careful about branding and making sure that you're not presenting concepts that are not yet ready for prime time. We spoke briefly about this before, but if you're not clearly communicating your revenue model or you're making assumptions which don't align with what your audience understands, then that's really going to confuse them. One thing that I've seen really, and this happens very often, is it's very easy to read off data off of a slide. But what I'd really like to see as an audience member is the presentation of useful information. And this concept of the difference between data and information is one that goes way beyond the scope of our conversation today, but I think is one that, especially just as a quick side note, when you think about the concept of big data, the difference between information and data is really quite critical. Finally, in terms of confusing your audience, there's this concept of cognitive dissonance, and that's not something that you want to create necessarily in your audience. So do you mind if I go into this concept of cognitive dissonance a little bit?
Yeah, let's talk more about that.
So kind of giving you the clinical definition, so to speak, cognitive dissonance it's a type of psychological stress that will be experienced by your audience when we're asking them to hold two or more contradictory beliefs, ideas, values, whatever in their mind. And this creates a discomfort, or certainly in the least case will create questions or misunderstanding, and so you're just making your audience feel uncomfortable. So what we need to ask ourselves is, have we created a point of friction by having our audience incorrectly interpret what we've said or intended to say? What's interesting is sometimes you'll have a presenter, and of course it's good form, don't look at your slides, minimize the number of words on your slides, but they'll say something different than what's on the slides. So you're causing this point of friction, which is cognitive dissonance, because we're asking the audience to accept what we're saying and accept what they're reading, and there's a conflict there. So it's really important to make sure that the presentation slides say the same thing as what you're presenting. Now, to flip things around a little bit, though, there is such a thing as good cognitive dissonance, and especially with some groundbreaking startups that have products that are, dare I say, truly revolutionary. It could be that your product or proposal is so radical that you make people reevaluate their assumptions. The only thing to keep in mind here is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And this is one of my favorite quotes made popular by Carl Sagan. Let me give you a few more thoughts, though, here on these root causes, and then we can switch into, so what should I do to prevent these sorts of issues? So oftentimes the audience will appreciate, they may not even think of this as a question, but they will certainly appreciate hearing from you, what are you not going to do? And this oftentimes helps customers as well as investors understand that you as a company can focus and execute. Another one is, who are the key players? So this is the question that they're having. Many times I've seen, and even with pre-revenue companies that got the product, they'll show or present who the team is, but what the presentation is really hard to follow. It's usually small font. It's a very dry history of what each of the team players or key players, what their background is. And I think what we oftentimes forget is that, look, investors look at the team as much as the product. A product may fail, but the right team will almost always succeed. So we need to put a little bit more information there instead of leaving the audience wanting more as to why this is a special team. In my consultancy, I really push my clients to find ways to make the customers more productive, find ways to make the customers care. And I don't care myself, whether it's for selfish reasons or broader reasons like doing what's right for the company, but we're talking to a potential customer. How can you make them more productive? How can you make sure that you make them a hero in front of their bosses? So these are things that it's easy to overlook when we have this fantastic new product. But oftentimes selling is as much about the interpersonal connection and the quid pro quo as it is any of the real value of the product itself. Finally, just as a few more thoughts before we jump into the next set of questions here, too often we forget that our audience is also our customer and that marketing is the sale of ideas and concepts. The way I see it, if you can't sell the idea, then you can't sell them the product. And the product might be, hey, it's an investment in my company. So first, you need to sell the idea, then you can sell them the product. But to be clear, selling an idea does not mean not providing facts, figures, and hard data. It just means that it goes way beyond that.
So you've covered all the points of friction and the unasked questions. So what should you do to answer the question?
So let's go through the three types of questions that we discussed. And let's start with what I hope is the easiest one, which is what to do when you are presenting to your audience. What should you do when you're asked a question? And not to be trite or simplistic about it, but answer the question. We tend to meander, we tend to wander when we answer questions. And we need to take a step back. It's okay to take a few seconds to think about the right answer. And sometimes the right answer is a simple yes or no. You may want to have a little bit of clarifying information, but the answer should be as direct and simple as possible. The other thing is that if we're asked a question, of course, that we do not have the answer to, assuming that it's not something we should know, because then, of course, that makes us look bad as presenters. But if it's a question that we don't have the answer to, the absolute worst thing to do, of course, is to invent an answer. Better just to say, let's discuss afterwards, or I'll get you the information as soon as I get back to the office, or when a particular person gets back in, I'll put you in contact with them. So I think that's in some ways the easiest answer here that we can give. about what to do when asked a direct question. But again, like I said, oftentimes it seems to get botched up.
So, what are some examples of unasked questions?
Well, I think for the unasked questions, I think we've already kind of covered some of those. But let's just think about this. Or let me take what you asked me and just turn it around just a little bit. And I think it's, since we're getting down to how do we address some of these issues, how do we anticipate the unasked questions? I think we just need to ask ourselves, look, I'm going to be presenting, figuring out what are my goals? Why are these people sitting there listening to me? It could be one of the opportunities that you provide to investors where they can pitch their company. Are you the only presenter? Are you at the end of many? There's different strategies that we can employ depending on that. What's the ask? Is your presentation structured to make it clear? Sometimes we're so busy selling our idea or hopefully our product that we forget that there's a call to action at the end of it. So we need to make sure that our presentation is structured to make it clear, because you don't want your audience asking themselves, well, what does this presenter want from me? So these are just a few of the ways to anticipate what an unasked question might be. But let me go into a few more details here. And some of these I think you'll find these are all absolutely real world and things that I've experienced myself or have seen from other people. So since at the very beginning of our conversation, I had proposed to discuss startups pitching products and startups pitching to investors. Let's go through some of these. So startups pitching products to, in this case, we'll say big companies. So here are some questions that your audience is gonna have in their mind. And if you don't answer these right up front, you're likely not going to get too much further. And let me maybe give a little bit of background here. As a startup pitching to a really big company that you want them to buy your product, their concerns are very, very different from smaller companies. They're going to want to know, are you going to be around in 5 years? What are your diversification strategies? Are you a one-trick pony? What are your quality processes? Can you deliver on time and at high volume? Can you handle the support load? This issue of support is one that I see over and over again in startups, that they feel like, hey, once I sell my product, I'll have all this money to reinvest into the next generation of products. And they completely forget that they need to support that first generation of products, and that a non-insignificant amount of money has to be spent on support, because that's how you really create your repeat customers. Not just having a great product, but of course, having great support of your product. If we take a look at startups pitching to investors, interestingly enough, if we put on our risk hat, investors, as we talked about before, they're interested in understanding the risks. Well, a lot of the things that we spoke about above are the exact same things that they're going to want to know about as well. Now, additionally, they'll be asking, can you really justify your revenue projections? What is your long-term competitive strategy? I know as an investor, I look at what are the long-term differentiators? What are the things that prevent others from copying your product and selling for cheaper? So, of course, in this specific example I just gave, comprehensive IP portfolio is important, as long as the desire is there to defend it. But those are the sorts of things that your startup investors are going to want to hear. And I mean, these are a little bit beyond what I would consider the obvious ones, but I think hopefully that's a good set of examples of these unasked questions. Are there others that you think of that we should put on this list?
Well, there's many issues that startups struggle with in pitching to investors. And some of them that I see come up are, investors thinking, how are we going to make money? And there's usually not a lot of thought to that process. We're just going to sell product and money is going to fall out as a profit no matter what we do. And so costs and other things are not very well considered. And so you can end up with losing money. And so in these slides, what I find is that the entrepreneur looks at the opportunity in the business and the investor's looking at the risk. And so if you can think about what risks are in the business that they may consider that helps inform your presentation, because you can then talk about how you've mitigated those risks. And the fundamental question in most investors' minds is product validation and market validation. Prove to me the product works, and prove to me people will pay for it. And so many people come in and they just talk about the forecast. Somebody someday is going to buy this product, but that's as far as it goes. And it makes a big difference if you can come in and say, I have already sold it to people and already have people who are happy with it. You don't have to do a lot, but you have to do a little bit of that just to demonstrate product validation and market validation. And now you've mitigated the risk at some level.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're really talking about the motivating factors, why your customers want something. And you're absolutely right. I think a lot of people don't think about that, and that does create points of friction. And it kind of also, where it does, in fact, completely back up the point I made previously about unrealistic revenue projections. So not understanding what is going to motivate your customers to buy your product and not being able to present that absolutely creates points of friction.
You talked about making an engaging presentation, and one of the things I find engaging is when somebody comes out with a truly radical business opportunity that really moves the needle. They say to unseat an incumbent, you have to be 10x better than the incumbent. And that doesn't mean it's just cost is 10x cheaper or the productivity is 10x better. It's usually a combination of the two, but it needs to add up to be 10x in order to get somebody to switch over. If you get 10x, well, now you have something going. And so always looking for things that are compelling in a presentation that grabs people's attention. And sometimes when the presentation is not very good, either they don't have the 10x or they're not telling it very well. And so you must have a growth story, you must be able to tell it, are two of the key things in order to grab people's attention and carry it forward. Otherwise, as you said, you lose their attention and you get into this cognitive dissonance going on because you're not engaging them very well. So it's something to consider as well.
Yeah, agreed. And it's interesting you bring that up because I call that buying the risk. When you're a startup competing with incumbents, your customers are going to expect for you to buy the risk, making sure that your product is so much better that you are able to minimize the risk of the fact that you are a startup.
Absolutely. There's many risks in these deals, and you have to overcome those to show how you've proven it works and demonstrate the growth story. As the saying goes, you can talk the talk, but in the end, you have to walk the walk.
Yeah, exactly. I think the last thing that we didn't really cover is just ensuring that you don't create more questions than you've answered. And just very quickly, I think this is also very important. If it's not obvious to everyone, practice your presentations before you go live. Hopefully present to somebody that has no idea what it is that you're presenting and take their questions seriously, because if they don't understand something, it's very likely your final audience won't either. So make sure your slides and your words are aligned. And for sure, never make any absolute or hyperbolic statements. Okay, now that I've said that, I'll follow it up with, unless you explain them right away or can effectively back them up. Again, this has to do with whether it's revenue projections or the impact that the product will have on the market. It's easy to get carried away, and that's a very easy way to lose your audience, create points of friction, because if you can't explain it, they're not going to accept it.
Well, that's great. Well, I appreciate you sharing the information about points of friction and answering the unanswered questions. I see that every day in presentations, and of course, it's part of the process of learning how to pitch better in order to be a better communicator. And that's how investors judge startups, is how they communicate, and have they done their homework, and do they exude confidence, and do they know what they're doing? So how best for the audience to get back in touch with you?
Well, how about if they go to the show notes, they can see my email address, phone number, LinkedIn account link there, and I'm available all the time. I live here in Austin, Texas, same as you. So I'm looking forward to hearing from members of your audience.
Great. We'll include those in the show notes. Appreciate your taking time to share this with us today and hope to have you back for a follow-up soon.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to you, Hall, for inviting me onto your podcast. And thank you to your audience for taking the time to listen to what I hope I was able to convey as an important concept.
Investor Connect helps investors interested in startup funding. In this podcast series, experienced investors share their experience and advice. You can learn more at investorconnect.org. Paul T. Martin is the director of Investor Connect, which is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the education of investors for early-stage funding. All opinions expressed by Hall and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of Investor Connect. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.